Hello, our truth warriors, and welcome back to the Atlantic Underground. Today's guest has been so on point with his work and revealing insight that's quite frankly too scary for many to absorb in their pre-programmed minds. But if you're watching this, there's a high possibility that you already know who this gentleman is and what he's achieved. You're actually part of our tribe, and we're going to get you up to speed with exactly what's happening. Dr. David Martin, it's absolutely incredible to see you again. We've got a lot to catch up upon. How are you doing?
Chris, I've never been better. I just welcomed my third grandchild into the lovely place we call Earth just yesterday morning, and I'm having a good time.
Excellent.
And it was a lot of fun holding a brand new little life. Reminds me why I do what I do.
I know there's nothing like it. I mean, I think back to when our kids were born, and it's a life-defining moment, and I imagine it's very much the same even when it's your grandchildren as well.
You know, it's funny. I love the fact that life persists. I think it's such a cool thing.
Yeah,
And I learned back, many, many years ago, how sad it is for humans who don't have that perspective.
yeah.
People who don't see life as something worth pursuing. They don't see life as something worth celebrating. And I think a lot of the reason why we're in the mess we're in right now is because there's a worldview where there are a lot of people who just simply do not think life should persist. And
No, no.
I happen to rather love it. It's fun, and I love being a dad. I will always count that as one of my greatest experiences of life.
Yeah,
And I have to say, the experience of holding the next generation, and more importantly, watching my kids become parents, which is such a great experience. I mean, you hope that you turned out all right with as a parent when you have
yeah.
kids, but when you see your kids being great parents, then you're like, okay, something went right. So
And you also get to say to them, now you know. Now,
yeah,
everything that I told you growing up,
yeah,
every parent says, wait till you have kids of your own.
yeah, yeah. I have to say, I mean, I am grateful for the experience of being a parent, but I'm watching my kids become better parents than I ever was. I mean, just great human beings. I'm super grateful for all of them.
But
And
that's testament
so
to what you've done bringing your own children up.
yeah, there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, let's kick this off with asking about gain of function. How
Yeah.
dangerous is it? How many labs are operating and who's behind it?
Well, so let's start with the definition. So gain of function as a construct is a politically correct term that is more appropriately considered as a biological weapons enabling technology. When you take anything in nature, whatever the thing is in nature, and you decide to amplify one attribute of it at the expense of considering the other consequences, that's a bad idea. And it has always been a bad idea, by the way. This is not something that is a new idea for humans. We go back to the Greek and Roman military campaigns when they lobbed various things, pestilence filled, jars. We have evidence of corpses that were infected with all sorts of things being thrown onto ships.
Yeah.
This has been done for a long time. The problem is that beginning in the late part of the 1800s, early part of the 1900s, we started isolating and amplifying all kinds of things, bacteria, fungus, all sorts of things, and seeing how we could turn them into more lethal, more damaging, more harmful kinds of things.
Yeah.
And it's all done under this ruse, Chris, which is we need to anticipate what the bad guys might do. That's the cover story. The cover story is we need to anticipate what the bad guys might do, so that we can get ready to make countermeasures to what the bad guys can do. And the assumption in that is they're good guys.
Yeah.
I have bad news for everybody who believes that nonsense. If you take any form of nature, I don't care what it is, and you decide to weaponize that, that is a horrible idea, period. And we as a civilized humanity should outlaw it today. There should be no possibility of doing that for any reason whatsoever. I'm going to give you a great example. In the early 1900s, the Japanese knew that Bacillus thuringiensis toxin was damaging to the GI system. Now, the reason why they knew that is they were trying to figure out how to deal with caterpillars that were ingesting vegetables, largely things like broccolis and cauliflowers and cabbages and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And they found out that Bacillus thuringiensis toxin had a great way of making the gut of caterpillars leaky so that they'd eat some of the vegetables, but they'd die. Now, in the early part of the 1900s, it became very clear that not only did BT toxin create this leaky gut problem, but tiny little problem. While it was very effective at knocking out caterpillars, it also happened to create leaky guts in people.
Yeah.
So giant shock. Fast forward to companies like Pioneer Seed and now Monsanto and DuPont and all these guys who come along with genetically modified crops. And lo and behold, to genetically modify a crop, they decide to use, are you ready for this? Bacillus thuringiensis, which is why we have BT cotton, corn, BT wheat, BT soybeans, BT you name it. And we're suddenly mystified, Chris, by how many people have colitis and have Crohn's disease and have food allergies and have lactose and, peanut and this and that and the other intolerance. And you sit there going, hold on a minute. By 1904, you got the date there, 1904. We knew this was a problem.
Yeah.
But because we decided that gain of function, in this case, using a pathogen model, Bacillus thuringiensis bacteria, using that model to genetically modify seed products was a good idea. Well, it was a horrible idea.
Yeah.
And people sit there going, yes, but Dave, the Green Revolution fed so many people, made agriculture so efficient, blah, blah, blah. Well, okay, yeah. If you're down with Monsanto's Roundup, which is known to be gut toxic and everything else, so let's start with that. And then, oh, by the way, we're going to use Bacillus thuringiensis, and we're going to use the toxin of that Bacillus thuringiensis. And so what we're going to do is we're going to combine two gut-killing functions, and we're going to wonder why 40% of the civilized world now has gastrointestinal problems.
Yeah.
What's the problem? The problem is, in the interest of what we call science, what happens is that commercial interests love to conspire to maximize profits without paying any attention to the consequence. And in the case of this, we've got a big problem. Now, specifically to your question, in 1953, when we decided to award Watson and Crick the Nobel Prize for something they did not discover, which they called DNA.
Yeah.
And it's important for us to realize that was a fraud. It was a fraud perpetrated by Cold Spring Harbor Labs. Look it up. It's not my opinion. And specifically the eugenics office at Cold Spring Harbor Labs. I don't know if you heard the term eugenics before, Chris, but last time I checked, eugenics is not part of public health.
No. Bill Gates seems to think
about
so.
Killing people. And we come up with this model of DNA. Now, we know that DNA as a construct is nothing more than a theoretical model. What really happens inside of cells is chromosomes. And yes, they have molecular things that we've described as DNA, but that's not actually how life happens. Life happens in multidimensional reality, not in double helixes that are wound on each other. But the fact of the matter is we came up with that model, then we came up with the model of protein synthesis, and then we came up with the model of genetics, and we came up with the model of all this other stuff. But here's the tiny problem. We started messing around with the ingredient list without ever understanding that, at best, modern science has described somewhere in the neighborhood of 95% of what we call DNA of the human. They've described it as junk. So our understanding of what we think we understand is statistically less than random error. Because if you ever took statistics courses, you realize that 0.05% or 0.05, so 5%, is what's considered to be random error. We know less about the human being than we have random error in a measurement. So we know nothing about it, but we feel very comfortable modifying it. We feel very comfortable with CRISPR technology editing it, but we have no idea what we're doing because we have a broken model that was built by a eugenics office, and now we're applying that broken model to a bunch of things. So gain of function as a construct when it comes to genetics explicitly is a horrifically horrible, terrible, miserable, no recovery, bad idea.
Yeah.
Now here comes the kicker. Right now we have over 2,700 patents on 68 gain of function targets in the United States bioweapons labs today, of which 3 are associated with SARS. So lest you think that we've got a problem on our hands, it's safe to say Houston Methodist Hospital, we have a problem.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, that was a joke for people who are very sophisticated, because if they understand how corrupt Houston Methodist Hospital is, where in addition to forcing employees long before there was a universal mandate to put biological weapons toxins into the arms of the general population, Houston Methodist notoriously put it in the arms of their healthcare workers without ever disclosing the fact that Anthony Fauci had a contract with Houston Methodist Hospital and with others to actually test whether or not you could get healthcare workers to be suckered into taking medical countermeasures without forcing them to do it. And it was a social experiment that was funded by NIAID. So even our healthcare workers who ultimately found themselves injected were ones subject to a clinical trial they didn't know they were participating in.
That's disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. And is it safe to say that the amount of gluten intolerance that we see in people as well is from the same issue with the corn?
No question.
Yeah, that's it.
No question. And we only had this data since, I don't know, the first decade of the last century. So
yeah,
it really snuck up on us. It was one of those mysterious things we could never have seen coming.
And would it be right in thinking that the CRISPR technology that you mentioned is pretty much funded and handled by DARPA?
Well, yeah, so let's have a little fun with that one. My favorite name to mention, as you know, is Dustin Moskowitz, the anonymous co-founder of Facebook who allowed Mark Zuckerberg to be the public face of Facebook. But Dustin Moskowitz, who was definitely a co-founder and lead funder and one of the largest shareholders, Dustin Moskowitz has a thing called open philanthropy, and through his various agencies, in addition to funding all of the desktop exercises, tabletop exercises that anticipated the most recent pandemic and several others, he was also the inventor in Sherlock Biosciences, which happens to be the first CRISPR technology to get emergency use authorization during COVID, which I know is going to come as a shock to anybody, that the guy who funded the pandemic and funded the propaganda campaign had financial interest before we even got to the first shot.
Yeah.
Now, it turns out that if you go back and look at their early documents, you find out that CRISPR technology, gene editing technology, and you're old enough and bald enough to remember this. You remember when Dolly the sheep was being cloned?
I do.
And all the crap that happened where we had the Pope losing his mind, that, you know, humans were playing God and the world was falling apart. The UK finally succumbed, and that project bounced around the world till it ended up in Singapore, where we were mutating sheep and doing all kinds of nonsense. But it turns out that it's very funny, because that whole Dolly the sheep exercise, which led to the moral consternation of religious authorities all over the world saying, oh, how dare you play God? Ironically, it was a good test run to find out how you can silence religion, because it turns out that with the mRNA injections, which are far worse, by the way, than any cloning that anybody's ever done.
Yeah.
You had idiots like the Pope. You had idiots like the religious right here in the United States who were saying that that the rapid Operation Warp Speed allegedly vaccine production program was a gift from the divine himself. And we had people lining up. You know, if you look at a picture of Pope Francis right now and you see how bloated his face is, you see the post-COVID injection effects. That guy is dying of God's gift to the world. And nobody in the Vatican has the balls to actually say it. But the fact of the matter is he is actually now suffering from now what they're officially calling pneumonia. But if you actually did any biopsy on him, you'd find out is he has spike protein all over his body, and he's having an autoimmune disease that's going to kill him.
Yeah.
And the fact is that, you know, God's messenger on earth got the message wrong. He picked up the wrong phone. And hate to break it to the faithful Catholics out there, but, you know, they got it wrong. But they, along with all of the other institutions. And what we have is a world in which we have these nonsensical programs where we run these market tests to try to figure out how the public is going to fall for things. And then a couple of years later, we run the actual scam. And not surprisingly, CRISPR was the gateway drug that was slipped under the entire COVID scheme. And we're still not talking about it enough.
No.
We should be talking about the idea that editing the genome of humanity is a horribly bad idea, which will end horribly badly. And unfortunately, people aren't talking about it.
No, it is. It's insane. From what you've seen, how trustworthy would you say the current government is now? And are they really in charge? I mean, how far up the chain do these orders come from, do you think?
Well, so as a lot of people know, I take a very controversial stance on this, and people are not pleased with it. But I have always said that people who think that the president is the most powerful person on earth and who think that, you know, cabinet level appointees are powerful, have no basis in reality in their assessment of how things really work. The fact of the matter is that they have always been beholden to their funding sources, and their funding sources have always tried to stay as anonymous as possible. So, as you know, I've made the bad habit of naming names and talking about the funding sources. So
yeah,
I don't mind talking about the fact that Palantir and Peter Thiel was one of the largest contributors to the Trump campaign. I don't mind talking about the fact that Bob Mercer was one of the largest contributors to the Republican campaigns. And I don't mind talking about it because it happens to be inconveniently true. And it also happens to be that these organizations that are beneficiaries of the current administration's programs, giant shock, made an investment and they're getting a return on their investment. So giant surprise. It turns out that if you buy the presidency, you get benefits for buying the presidency. This is not some new phenomenon. We've been doing this for a long time. The problem that we have right now is we have an enormous number of people who think because Trump is in office, because Bobby Kennedy's been approved as HHS secretary, there's a number of people who think that the problems have been solved. But the problem with that assessment is exemplified by what happened with Elon Musk's giant uncovery when he was looking at the Treasury data. You'll note that he was very quick to point out the $53 million from USAID that went to Wuhan Institute of Virology. And I am going to be the first to say I'm glad that he actually outed that.
Yeah.
But somewhere not far down the page, in fact, it's probably above the page of that one, is the hundreds of millions of dollars that were used to fund biological weapons labs at places like University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Yeah.
And conveniently, nowhere on X did you see that post, except mine.
Yeah.
You don't see the actual story. So what you're doing is you're actually doing this smoke screen that goes, wow, Wuhan was worse than we thought, right? Because a lot of people thought it was 3.8 million or 3.5 million or whatever. Now it's 53. So now we get all this moral outrage and we get all the smart people going, look, it was Wuhan and it was a lab leak. And we all know that. You know what? They're still barking up the wrong tree. And I think when you actually put a stuffed animal raccoon up a tree and you get your dogs to bark at that, and you're not paying attention to the bobcat that's about ready to eat you from behind, then I'm less worried about the stuffed animal raccoon in the tree. And right now, the Wuhan story is getting press. And by the way, I'm not suggesting it shouldn't get press. I'm saying that it would take zero effort for any of the Doge campaign, any of them,
Yeah.
to actually unveil the amount of funding at universities across America that are currently doing biological weapons research. It would take zero effort to find it. And you have seen Elon Musk mention it. Oh, that's right. Never. You've seen all of the major liberal and conservative alt media talk about it. Oh, that's right. Never. You've never seen on anybody. I don't care whether it's, Jon Stewart and all of his folks on kind of the traditional alt side, John Oliver and others, that side, silence. But ironically, you've seen silence on the other side. You've never seen Tucker or Rogan or any of these guys talk about the bioweapons programs happening in the United States under university support. And nobody puts two and two together. When you see an elected official going into Congress, they get $200,000-$300,000 a year salary. They go into Congress, and 10 years later, they have $150 million.
Yeah.
Or in the case of a couple more recent, $240 million. Now, Chris, I don't know about you, but it feels like there must be some money laundering going on somewhere because, oh, that's right, we don't want to talk about this. We don't want the public to know that our state universities in America are currently money laundering exercises as slush funds to move money from the federal government to elected officials through the cunning use of lab research that should never be done under any civilized nation on earth. And we don't have any problem with that happening. And not a single person in the media is willing to talk about it.
So effectively, it's like bread and circuses. The people who are supporting these people now are cheering at what they're being thrown. But at the end of the day, it's not what they're saying. It's what's being hidden and not discussed.
Yeah.
It really speaks volumes, which means people should educate themselves outside the field of what they're being programmed to think.
Right. And listen, let me, like I've said, Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 7 of the Constitution says that the public's supposed to have a regular, accounting for the money that's spent under congressional authorization by the Treasury.
Yeah.
I'm all for it. And I think what Doge is doing, by the way, as a tip of the iceberg exercise is great. So celebrate Elon for the good he is doing, which is far better than what we've seen in the past. So I'm on board with that. I think it's great. I think what's missing, and it's conspicuous when you hear it, when I tell you this and I say, we are given laundry lists of DEI programs, right? Where it's, transgender bathroom here and, transgender education there and whatever else. So we're given a laundry list of DEI frauds, and they may be, $20 million here, $50 million here, somewhere else. You know what we've never seen in any of the Trump administration's great unveilings of all the financial frauds? We haven't seen a single dollar ever reported on the U.S. university bioweapons labs that are jointly funded by NIAID and DARPA.
Yeah.
Now, if we really want transparency, where's that data?
Yeah.
Because it's in the same file, Chris. It's in the same file. All you have to do is hit print.
Yeah.
So this is not some sort of deep conspiratorial anything.
Yeah.
All of these grants are numbered. I have the grant numbers, and I don't break into federal government systems.
Yeah.
I have the grant numbers. So Doge could do a real public service by pulling away the giant and now, fully propped up illusion that somehow or another our academic institutions are somehow above reproach, above corruption. Are you kidding? Find a university that's not doing at least one illegal action under federal funding, and I'll tell you what, you could count on one hand the number of universities that might fall into that category. Maybe.
Yeah, it's crazy. One thing I am seeing at the moment, which I'm finding interesting, obviously with the Doge thing going on, we've just seen thousands of tons of gold being brought from the Bank of England and
Yeah.
brought into the COMEX into the US. Now, there's very few people in the world that have the power to bring this amount of gold in the thousands of tons. And do you think the likes of Doge, and there's always been the talk, even going back as far as Ron Paul, that they always wanted to audit the Fed? Do you think they're putting the gold in there now so when Doge eventually turns to auditing the Fed, that the gold is there? Or is there something far more sinister going on in the background, possibly in relation to backing up a digital currency with a gold standard again?
Well, I have said many times, and this goes back to 2011, when the what was then called the non-aligned movement, which was what then became known as the BRICS countries. So the countries that were kind of in the second tier orbit of the World Trade Organization's kind of organization structure. When they started doing cross-border transactions with these very interesting programs called synthetic drawing rights, these SDRs, which are ways to settle accounts across multiple jurisdictions, where you have kind of a blended currency approach, where it can include counter trade, it can include physical assets, it can include commodities like energy, food, etc. It can include all sorts of things, but these synthetic drawing rights or special drawing rights, depending on which version of the documents you're looking at, when these things were starting to gain popularity from 2011 forward, after the second GFC, what we saw was a kind of a underlying drumbeat that started largely with the Chinese, where they started marking down their treasury holdings. Yeah. And the problem with marking down treasury holdings is that when you get to maturity, you have a very interesting problem, because the whole value of a treasury is the yield. But if you start marking down those holdings, then the yield actually can go negative. And then after 2011, a bigger problem happened, which is Goldman Sachs and a few others were tapped by the Treasury to actually not only buy treasuries at par, but get paid a commission fee for buying them at par. Now, the problem with that mathematically is that means that they started with a negative asset value, and the negative asset value increased over time. So we have an illusion, which I don't know if you remember back when Silicon Valley Bank collapsed a couple years ago. Yeah. There was a whole kind of early rumbling that, oh my gosh, if Silicon Valley Bank could collapse, maybe a bunch of other banks have some insufficiency of their treasury holdings under what was then called the bank reserve currency allocation. Well, the story was way worse than was ever reported, because the fact of the matter is we found out that the whole house of cards, which is the basis of a reserve currency, is in fact based on nothing but a Ponzi scheme. These are just, paper contracts sitting on top of paper contracts. And when you pull all the layers back, you find out that the emperor has no clothes. Now, the problem that presents with respect to the United States government is pensions under the 1976 ERISA Modified Act, which is the act that sets out retirement standards, mandated that retirements and pensions had to buy a certain percentage of treasuries. Now, here comes a little tiny problem. If your pension is full of treasury holdings, which have either flat or negative value. Remember, we did have treasuries giving negative yields for a big chunk of the 2000 teens. So if you have pensions that are allegedly having a statutory requirement to hold treasuries, but those treasuries are going down in value, and then you have long dated pension programs and programs like FDIC and the the programs which are part of the Federal Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, PBGIC. If you go back and you look at those programs, all of which are holding these assets, the assets that they're holding are not being marked to market. So we're not seeing the actual value represented. So the fair value, which back in 2011 was somewhere in the negative $11 trillion range. By 2015 became negative $14 trillion. Now is well in excess of negative $22 trillion. And then you have on top of that the fraud that Doge has just brought out, which is the fact that somewhere along the line we have $4 to $5 trillion that just has gone missing, just gone. We don't know. It's just gone missing.
Sounds
You
familiar.
put all those numbers together and you find out that the GDP of America actually isn't good for the amount of money we owe anybody, including ourselves. And so when you look at that mathematics of just what's wrong with the math financially, what you find is a very interesting challenge, which is at some level, there has to be a return to some form, and I'm being very precise here, some form of a backed currency. Now, that backing could be, as has been suggested by the Indians and the Chinese, it can be a basket of currencies or a basket of commodities, which is one approach. It can be some form of resurgence of some form of the gold standard. Tiny problem there is we don't have enough gold for that to be a global standard. So at best, it will be nothing but a fraction of a gold standard. And then you have the extreme, what I would call, silly engineering exercises where, there's a number of people who have advocated for some sort of Bitcoin blockchain of everything, where they count every tree in Siberia and somehow say, well, the future value of the lumber in Siberia is X, therefore we're going to count it as Y. That lunacy is still out there, and there's still a number of people proposing some version of that lunacy. What I would suggest to you, though, is that whether it's 5,000 tons or 8,000 tons, and whether it's repatriated gold or not, what I think you're going to find is that the gold standard argument is going to fail because China has not disclosed its actual gold holdings. There's a guy, and this is back in the day before people thought that I was COVID, when I was known for my appearances on financial networks, there was a guy who I brought attention to called Robert Friedland, worked very closely in cooperation with a number of governments, most recently a lot of Southern Africa as well as Chinese government. He's notorious for finding significant gold reserves all over the world. This goes back to his collaboration with Steve Jobs when Apple was being formed. And by the way, if you ever want one of the most bizarre stories on earth, go look that one up, Steve Jobs and Robert Friedland. But the fact of the matter is, this guy who euphemistically was referred to as Toxic Bob because of the horrific environmental damage his mines did around the world, helped the Chinese government find and ultimately access significant gold finds in China. And what we know is that the early production numbers that came out of some of those mines far exceeded what the Chinese were reporting. So the problem we're going to have, and this is the bad news, Dave Martin once again depressing all of humanity. The problem we're going to have is just when we think we know what the value of gold is, the Chinese already have a countermeasure on that because they have an undisclosed gold reserve that is far in excess of what has been declared. And that is brought to you largely courtesy of the collaboration with Robert Friedland. Bad news for the United States, and the bad news for the United Kingdom, and the bad news for everybody who's been dollar or pound or euro dependent is that until we know what the Chinese holdings actually are, we don't really have a basis for what we think the value of gold is. And that's going to create a problem. And I've heard tons of people in the alt media going, oh, get in the metals market, get in the metals market, get in the metals market. I'm not suggesting that metals markets inherently are bad. I am suggesting that metals markets without a disclosure on how much metal there is dangerous because you are subject to highly volatile price fluctuations that are not something that you can control. And in the case of gold, I can guarantee, this is not Dave hypothesizing, this is Dave certain because I've actually seen some of the early production numbers. I know that the Chinese report is not actually correct. Now, how far off is it? I don't know, but I can guarantee you that people who think that gold is going to be this steady as she goes climbing asset are going to have some bumps along that road.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's a possibility? I know that the Treasury itself, for some reason, while gold currently is valued at 3,900 thereabout per ounce, that they're still valuing a gold ounce on their sheets at $35. Now, do you think they will use the revaluation of gold to try and offset the amount of money that is in debt for that country and try and clear that debt? And then we're going to have
Yeah.
China jump in and say, not on our watch, boys. Look what we've got.
Yeah, well, see, that's where the problem is, because China's holding actual treasury notes and they're holding gold that's undisclosed value.
Yeah.
So, you know, is the Treasury going to try to do something? Probably. They're going to try to mark to market some version of what they think the asset is worth. The bad news is, like I said, you know, this goes back to 1776 in terms of economic theory. If you're going to build a price based on what you think is a scarce asset, you better know how much of that scarce asset exists.
Yeah.
Because if you don't know and you set a price, you paint yourself into a corner you can't get out of. And this is going to be a fairly significant problem. And so, you know, listen, great news is these things have come and gone. I mean, if you go back to the Second World War and you would have said, you know, after the bombings all across Germany, the Deutsche Mark would never come back. By 1966, the Deutsche Mark was still one of the most favored currencies on the planet.
Yeah.
So the fact of the matter is, you know, are we going to make it through this? Yep, we are. Are there going to be some winners? Probably. Are there going to be a lot of losers? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But this, like everything else, Chris, is something where people benefit from being informed and benefit from knowing where to look. And if you don't have information and you don't know where to look, the likelihood is high that you're going to get, you know, you're one of the many people that are going to be sheep to the slaughter, despite your best intentions. And that's why I tried to keep people alert to the fact that, you know, these are not unknowns. These are just not overly discussed topics.
Yeah, definitely. Now, recently we had Dr. Peter McCulloch on, and I mentioned that he would be a great guest on Joe Rogan. Firstly, would you like to take the opportunity to speak on the Joe Rogan show if that was available? And can you also clarify what Dr. Peter McCulloch got wrong in regards to your work?
Well, so I have an axiomatic position that my grandfather said, which is never attribute to malevolence what is ignorance. And I try to honor that. You know this about me, Chris. You know, I am one of the few people in the COVID narrative who actually lost audiences.
Yeah.
I was on CNBC, I was on Bloomberg, I was on mainstream media. You know, I was articles in the Wall Street Journal celebrating the white collar crime investigations we did with the U.S. Treasury. And so COVID was not a credentialing exercise for me. COVID was another chapter in a life of those exercises in which I've been engaged.
Yeah.
And when Dr. McCullough made the comments about, you know, the fact that somehow or another he didn't feel like I was early in the game, I found those to be just tragically ironic, given the fact that if you go back to 2001, when the anthrax investigation was going on, it was Chuck Schumer's office that reached out to me to look at the whole anthrax, aerosolized anthrax, and the ciprofloxacin scandal. I wasn't planning on doing this, but since you asked a question, I'm going to give you a tiny little piece of history. Yep. And the good news is it's not far behind me. It's just right here. Nice to have a stage prop when you didn't know you were going to use it. If you're not familiar with Farsi, which, you know, probably not a lot of folks are, This is a plaque that was given to me on the 25th of March, 2005. And then I'll read you where it was from. This was from the National Research Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, Tehran, Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, one of the things that I can guarantee you is nobody who's made their fame around COVID has that plaque.
No, you're probably right.
None of them were on the stage on Easter Sunday morning when I gave the keynote speech at the Iranian Biotechnology Bioengineering Conference, where I learned about the biological weapons programs that the United States was funding in enormous amounts of the Eastern Bloc countries. I'm sure that Peter McCullough probably doesn't have access to both the public and classified briefings I gave on the biological weapons programs that included things like, are you ready for this? SARS-CoV.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, you have. And the problem is really simple. And this is the reason why I try to be respectful about this. Dr. McCullough and others, because this particular pandemic gave them a new platform and a new audience, have needed to turn this particular exercise into a credentialing exercise. And I don't fault anybody for doing that. I think what he's done as a clinician is fabulous.
Yeah.
I think the work he did, and I've read most of his publications that I've been able to get my hands on, I think the clinical work and the research that he's done is actually quite remarkable, and I think it helps a lot of people. I don't think that anybody should ever use the degradation of a colleague to promote themselves.
Yeah.
And certainly the misrepresentation of a colleague, which is horrific and inappropriate in every instance. And the fact of the matter is to suggest that somehow or another, when Kim and I started doing our YouTube broadcasts, ironically, at the very, very, very beginning of the pandemic, we were having regular calls that then became full YouTube video channels in the first quarter of 2020, before anybody was talking about the pandemic. There was no social media awareness at all. And ironically, Kim, my wife, was the one who put a camera in front of my face one day and said, hey, there's this thing called Facebook Live. Let's give it a shot. And then she was ludicrous enough, Chris. And this was Kim, I had nothing to do with it. She went online. She figured out how many people you needed to get YouTube to give you a channel. So that night, after we saw, I don't know, 30 or 40 or 50 or however many people show up on a Facebook Live, that night she sent an invitation to a bunch of her friends in Australia saying, hey, sign up on YouTube for a channel that we're going to do called David Martin World. And by 24 hours later, we had enough people signing up that YouTube gave us a channel. And so by March, we were actually doing broadcasts. And so when Peter said that he had no evidence of us talking about COVID during the first quarter of 2020, I sat there going, except for the fact that I've got a YouTube channel that has butterflies of the week that are in the first quarter of that year. And I have briefings in 2019 and 2018 and publications on biological toxins going back to 2002.
Yeah.
So I don't, like I said, I don't understand what's being served that way. But then if we go to the second piece of the question, I use as my guide in my life a very simple proposition, which is I go where I'm invited.
Yeah.
I have not pursued, nor will I pursue any speaking or interview or anything else. And I don't do that because the information I have is exactly that. It is information. David Martin, the person, David Martin, the brand, David Martin, the identity, is not being served with the current pandemic. I lost audiences. I lost my platforms. I lost my voice that spoke to an enormous audience. And it was, in fact, things like the European Union Parliament speech, which now, according to the most recent statistics, has been seen close to 4 billion times on Earth. Probably the most watched or downloaded video in human history, according to what has been reported to me.
Yeah.
It is very courageous programs like Mickey Willis's Plandemic Indoctrination, which started off being a multi-voice piece. And then because of the work that I was doing, that largely became a project that was largely my content. And, you know, I think of Mickey Willis's Plandemic 2 and Brian Rose's willingness to live stream that when the entire world was saying, you know, we're going to block it.
Yeah.
And Chris, you know, Mickey's courage, Brian Rose's courage to live stream it led to, at the time, the most downloaded and watched live stream in the history of the internet at the time. That feature film was a record setter. We beat Taylor Swift for I think 4 or 5 weeks in more downloads of Plandemic 2 Indoctrination. And my point is simple. I think Joe Rogan has done a fabulous job. In fact, of all the people with a public voice, I think his ability to hold open space for conversations that were critical and important was actually exceptional. I don't understand what his curation mandate is, and I don't understand his editorial decision.
Yeah.
I'm surprised, many instances I'm surprised, where he will bring people on who are absolutely not telling any primary source material. In fact, the vast majority of his guests when it came to the pandemic were doing Google-based research. They were not doing primary research. They weren't people who had 2 decades of bioweapons experience. And so I am somewhat surprised at the fact that secondary source material is considered to be newsworthy, but primary source material isn't. But I also know something else, which is I'm not an opinion guy. I've not shared my opinions about any of this stuff. My commitment has been to relay facts from which people can draw their own conclusions.
Yeah.
And I think that there are people, and I think, you know, Joe's probably one of them. I think Tucker's another, where for the value of their audiences, I think that they like to have people who have a bit more of the, shall we say, the human interest, maybe a bit more of the philosophical conversation.
Yeah.
Where I may come across as a little too dry and a little too academic. And so I don't know. But the good news is, like I said, I go where I'm invited, and I have been extremely grateful for the people who have had the courage. And I would put Mickey Willis up at the top of that list. I mean, in terms of people who had a lot to lose, Mickey had a lot to lose. Brian Rose had a lot to lose. And, you know, I can assure you that, you know, what Mickey did with Plandemic 2 Indoctrination is going to go down, in my estimation, it's going to go down in history as one of the most pivotal points. Because if you remember that time, Chris, that was a time when everybody was trying to censor, you know, at the extreme.
Oh, yeah.
And for Mickey, you know, for Mickey to hold his ground, continue to do the production, continue to take the slings and arrows on that.
Yeah.
I will forever respect what I think is one of the greatest performances. Yeah. And so, you know, if anybody ever asks and says, "Hey, Dave, I think our audience can benefit from your perspective," you know, I've been happy to say yes to those.
Yeah.
But am I aspiring to being on anybody's show?
No.
Nope. Haven't been before, and I'm not going to be anytime. I mean, I didn't aspire to be on CNBC. I didn't aspire to be on Bloomberg. I just happened to be able to make sense out of things that the public made sense out of. I never aspired to be testifying in front of Congress when I uncovered what at the time was the second largest tax fraud in U.S. history. Yeah. I will tell you that the experience of doing that was actually quite instructive, because you find out that the the people who use fear as a means of trying to silence you
Mhm.
don't understand that truth needs no defense.
No.
None. Truth does not need any defense, and it doesn't need advocates. All it needs is to be spoken. And, I had a lot of companies really upset with me in 2001 to 2003 when we were busting multi-billion-dollar tax frauds. And I was told many times that it won't go well for people like me who do what I do. And the fact of the matter is, I'm still bald, still wearing a bow tie, still doing what I do. And the titans of industry who were allegedly going to silence me just never got around to getting that done. So here I am.
Excellent. I mean, you enjoy life regardless of how insane it appears to be out there. What's
Yeah.
your secret to remaining positive, and what advice would you give to people out there to focus on the good in life?
So you're asking me at a great time because I've just had my ass kicked by life. And and I like that. I had a beautiful conversation just today with a physician that I've spent some time with, and he and I were talking about life and kind of how it unfolds. And Chris, I have a very powerful and very remarkable wife, Kim, and she's the reason why a lot of people in the alternative narrative know about me, because it was her impulse that got me to jump out of my old world and into a new world.
Yeah.
But what was interesting is we come from very, very different backgrounds, very different walks of life. If we were going to kind of match up shared life experiences, we have a giant goose egg next to what we've done that kind of came down the same path. And we've known each other for 10 years. And in the last couple of years, she had a very, very, very sharp critique of the person I was. She basically, in a nutshell, said that, I'm calling for accountability. I'm calling for the public to actually care about, things like integrity and things like the truth and all of the things that I value. And she said, the man that's on stage in public should also be the man who comes home.
Yeah.
And I have to say that I did not take that well. I'm not one that likes to do third-party inspired self-examination. I love to do my own self-examination, but I don't like it when I'm invited to do self-examination by others. That's not my strong suit. But I have to say that, the way in which she gave an enormous amount of insistence to saying, you're only as good as the weakest link in your chain. So freaking be as strong as you can be across the whole of the chain.
Yeah.
She had an enormous effect on giving me the opportunity to take a step back and say, all right, I've got whatever time I have left. I don't know how much time I have left, but I've got whatever time I have left. And I have been, for my entire life, playing around a narrative where I was pretty focused on my effectiveness, measured by the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's take as an example. I was going down Bond Street in London a couple months ago, and I had a football club who was walking down the other side of the street. They saw me. I was coming out of a business meeting. They came running across the road on Bond Street, and they were yelling my name. And, they're soccer hooligans from the UK. Like, God only knows what's happening next. They came up and gave me a big hug and said, hey, because of your videos, we didn't get the shot. And we wanted to thank you for that. And so what I did and what I've done throughout my whole life, whether it's mining justice in Papua New Guinea, whether it's, dealing with indigenous conflicts in South America, wherever it is, I've had a view that my worth is defined by the merits of the projects that I've done.
Yeah.
And so I stack up these accomplishments And somehow or another, if I just accomplish enough, then maybe, maybe Dave Martin was worth something. But I never examined until Kim gave me the opportunity to do so. I never examined, do I value myself? And as a result, am I showing up as the man I want to be? Not as the human as I want to be. Because like the accomplishment pile is bigger than any pile I've ever seen. Like I got it, right? I mean, and I've got tons of external validation, but I was chasing a hungry ghost that was inside of me that was trying to somehow do enough to somehow be worthy of, fill in the blank, worthy of a relationship with her, worthy of being, seen as valuable. And what has given me this now at 57, almost 58, a renewed lease on life and even more of a spring in my step is this idea that maybe I was worth it all along. Maybe I could have figured myself into the equation all along. And if I wasn't looking for outside validation and found something on the inside that actually was like, yeah, you know what? Well done. You kicked ass today. Well done. Like if I could do that to myself, it would actually matter.
Yeah.
And I grew up in such a religious environment where ego was shunned and, self-approval was shunned and all of these, you're supposed to constantly be sacrificing. You're constantly supposed to be putting yourself down. And through the work that she helped, once again, as a 2x4 to the back of my head to get me to do it. But, when I started doing that examination, I realized, okay, hold on a minute. I have a beautiful life. I have an amazing life. I have had life experiences beyond the edge of anybody's dream.
Yeah.
I've published in God knows how many topics. I've spoken around the world. I've made huge impacts on people's lives all over the world. The work I have done has led to the health and wellness of millions of people in different places around the world. There's a ton of, if you put the scorecard up, there's a ton of really beautiful things, and I'm very grateful for all of those. But the truth is, in the last now couple months, what I've really found is I actually love David Martin. I love the complexity. I love the nuance. I love the fact that I fight like hell, for the things I care about. But I actually like the man I am now.
Yeah.
And I never would have said that, even a year ago, I wouldn't have said that. So I would say that the mission, which I still hold very dearly, and by the way, I will. I mean, as long as I'm breathing, I'm going to be fighting every battle I can fight. There's no accident that I've got an Arthurian sword behind me. I mean, and a helmet up there.
Yeah.
If I need to bring the A game, I'll do that. But the gift that I would say probably is somewhere front and center of Kim's gift to me, is that I thought you had to be worthy of love, and I think I've now realized that you don't have to be worthy of it. You have to be it.
Yeah.
And then when you're with somebody who is also being it, your life takes on a whole new contour. And so my Energizer Bunny battery got a heck of a lot more energy in it now. So kind of look out, world, because here I come. But it's now, Dave who actually cares about Dave this time.
Yeah. And I've got a lot of friends that talk about self-love. And once you master that, once you have love for yourself, you radiate it, and
Yeah.
it draws in the right energy and the right people around you all the time, and it is something to live by. But I do know that a lot of people live in this false paradigm around us. They want to project something that they're actually not onto social
Yeah.
media, pretend they've got things that they haven't got, put filters on so they don't even look like they're supposed to look, and living
Yeah.
living in this false world is trying to keep up with another person that's living this false life as well. And, if people could just sit down and be humble and realize who they are and have that self-love for themselves and
Yeah.
appreciate who they actually are, it's like they're very much in touch with the soul again. And being
Yeah.
being that is noticeable, absolutely noticeable to everyone else. And you're living the best life you can live at that point.
Yeah, and I think that's why, I just did one of my 12 senses workshops in Boulder the other week, and had people from all over the world. It was freaking amazing. I had such a great time.
Yeah.
Um, but what I loved about it was, I said this is my first acoustic album, and metaphorically, I mean, it's the first time I felt like I was just me. I wasn't trying to I wasn't trying to convince anybody of anything. I wasn't trying to overwhelm anybody with the passion of an argument or anything else. I was just sharing things I care about very deeply. I do care about them, and I will continue to care about them because that's who I am.
Yeah.
But the difference is it was coming from a space where I wasn't having to be the archetypal role that I think I've taken on. Where I could kind of lay down the chivalry thing about being the knight standing watch. I don't need to be that. I can be the guy who is more than happy to pick a fight because I will pick fights.
Mhm.
But I can also be a guy who's just me, and I'm not going to Photoshop myself into a better existence because I have a great existence.
Yeah,
I just have to see it that way.
absolutely. Now, what do you make of Fauci's pardon? And considering what RFK wrote about him in his book, are you actually surprised that he's not in handcuffs yet?
I'm not surprised he's not in handcuffs yet because nobody anywhere in law enforcement, and for that matter, in this administration, is willing to actually prosecute the real crime. Because remember, the real crime is actually treason.
Yeah.
And we have to call it what it is. Now, this treason happened to start off with racketeering. So in 1984, going into 1986, we know that Anthony Fauci got to his position in an NIH and then ultimately at NIAID to help ramrod the protection of liability shields for vaccine manufacturers. The 1986 Act is without question one of his early crowning achievements.
Yeah.
But we also have to understand that the industry capture of regulatory agencies and scientific agencies, so NIH, NIAID, National Science Foundation, FDA, CDC, all these guys, they are all captured agencies. And those are captured agencies where a criminal conspiracy, and it is a criminal conspiracy under the definitions of both the Sherman and the Clayton Act. So when I talk about this, I'm not using the metaphoric criminal conspiracy. I'm actually using the legal definition.
Yeah.
Is when there is an intent to defraud the public, limit their commercial options, do everything that is antitrust law violating. And that happens to have been Fauci's MO since 1986. When this becomes worse than just racketeering, though, Chris, is in 1999 when Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill figured out how to mutate what was then the coronavirus model that was largely affecting dogs and pigs and their GI systems. Since the 1966-1967 work on a variant of what we call the common cold, when he figured out how to get the SARS-CoV-2 model to target cardiac tissue, specifically in rabbits, leading to rabbit cardiomyopathy. Now, people don't know what that is because it's a big word, but what that means is you're essentially inflaming the heart muscle tissue and creating a hypertrophic change, meaning that the heart is expanding, but not expanding in a good way. It's actually inflamed and it becomes compromised. He led a program, Anthony Fauci, in collaboration with Ralph Barrick, led a program to weaponize the CoV model to hit both cardiac tissue and lung tissue. By 2002, Ralph Barrick, under the funding of Anthony Fauci, had presented the world with what he called an infectious replication defective clone of coronavirus. Now, what that was was the first announcement in 2002 in the patent that was filed from UNC Chapel Hill, was the announcement of the weaponization of this virus-based model. Here's where it gets bad. That's before SARS 1.0. But remember, in SARS 1.0, we were all supposed to be dying. We were all supposed to be getting sick, and only 800 people got sick, and some of those died.
Yeah.
Well, when you have an infectious replication defective clone, what you're doing is you're saying you're going to take the protein sequences that are derivatives of the, RNA and DNA, single-stranded DNA, and then RNA sequences. You're going to take those, you're going to put them into people, and they're going to get sick, but they're not going to transmit it to other people. And that's the reason why SARS 1.0 wasn't a global pandemic, much to their chagrin, because in April 2003, the CDC filed a patent on SARS-CoV-2 isolated from humans. One day later, a company called Sequoia Pharmaceuticals, which had never existed, never done anything, one day after CDC allegedly invented SARS-CoV-2 isolated from humans, one day later, Sequoia Pharmaceuticals had are you ready for this? A patent on the vaccine for this thing.
Bit odd.
Yeah. One would ask the question, how the hell could you file a patent on a pathogen one day and already have a vaccine for it the next day? Oh, that sounds familiar. Because the time warp that they're engaging in is a time warp that's not real. This is actually where we go from racketeering to collusion. We go from collusion to premeditated terror. And premeditated terror back in the early days of this latest pandemic still operated under Section 802 of the Patriot Act, which made coercing a population a felony punishable by 10 years in prison and a $100 million fine. Now, it turns out that if you go back to 2010, the same year Moderna was born out of the National Science Foundation's Darwinian Chemical Systems grant. You heard that correctly. Moderna, before it was Moderna, started off as Darwinian Chemical Systems. That was using RNA to write into the genome of an animal to change the animal's genome. That's what the business of Moderna was. And it became a company funded by Flagship Ventures. It became a company when they solved that problem. So all the bullshit we were told about, oh, well, RNA doesn't actually write into the genome, except for the fact that that's 20 years in the making. From 2000 to 2010, National Science Foundation grant. From 2010 to 2020, a company that we now know as Moderna. Here comes the kicker. In 2010, Ralph Baric published the antidote for SARS infection. Published it. And it turns out that it was zinc ionophores, and it could include things like vitamin D and other things. The Zelenko protocol, no kidding, that Zev Zelenko popularized at the beginning of the pandemic, was published in 2010 to be the antidote for SARS-CoV. Now, why on earth would we actually hide that information? Why, when Deborah Birx just a couple days ago gets on Piers Morgan's show and says, oh, well, we rolled out the vaccine in the wrong way. We really shouldn't have put it into everybody. We should have gone to at-risk population. No, you should have not done it at all, because a medical countermeasure under an emergency use authorization is only legally applied if there are no commercial alternatives already in the market. Chris, 2010 was before 2020 in every calendar on the planet. For 10 years, we had the antidote. It was published, and it was allegedly misinformation. Now, when the bomb maker of a bomb makes the antidote for the bomb, you know what I would do? I'd pay attention, because the reason why the bomb maker made the antidote is because he knew he was making a bomb. He said in 2005, funded by Anthony Fauci, funded by DARPA, he said he was making biowarfare enabling technology. And in 2010, he made the formula to make sure that he had a countermeasure so he didn't kill people who were making bombs. So the fact is that Anthony Fauci went from being just a bad actor who was part of the racketeering scheme to a murderer.
Yeah.
And that's a big jump. It's one thing to be engaged in felony racketeering. It's another thing to be engaged in murder. And unfortunately, murder became part of this program at the beginning of the pandemic. And the reason why I have such confidence in saying that is because we know that in November of 2019, before there was ever patient one at Wuhan, before that, we know that in 2018, and you can't make this shit up, in 2018, Moderna and the British Columbia-based manufacturer of the lipid nanoparticle, which is all part of the Acuitas Pharmaceuticals lipid nanoparticle manufacturer, were fighting over patents on stabilizing mRNA injections, and their patent fight was in 2018. Chris, Moderna wasn't making mRNA injections in 2018. Or were they? But if you go back and look at the lipid nanoparticle technology that was subject of that lawsuit, which was at the Patent Trials Appeal Board in 2018, that's when the decision was published, and you go back and you look at all of those fights, you realize that Anthony Fauci knew that he was putting into the injection lipid nanoparticles, which we knew were myotoxic, and pseudouridine, which was a stabilizing nucleic acid sequence variant, which we were going to put in to also make sure the mRNA achieved its goal. But the problem with both of those is that both of those were known to be lethal, not dangerous. They were known to be lethal in publications in 2018. So this is a problem because we've gone from racketeering to premeditated murder. So should he be in jail right now? Absolutely. The reason he's not in jail right now is very simple. No one who is an elected official and no law enforcement agent has the current capacity to deal with the tiny reality we talked about at the beginning of the show, which is we do not want to out the real number of perpetrators. Because when you pull back the first layer of this onion, you'll find that it's onion all the way down.
Yeah.
And the further you go, the more you realize that we have a country beholden to drug dealers. We have a country beholden to this liability shield. And we do not have a political appetite right now. And by the way, look at State Street, look at BlackRock, look at Vanguard, look at all of the major financial institutions who all profiteered on the back of not only this first round, but they've profiteered on the back of every single one of these fake pandemics, and they will continue to do so. The fact of the matter is, the public, if it was fully informed, would not tolerate any of what's going on. Yeah. But the problem is the public is willfully uninformed, because if we actually informed them, we would find out that the rot is way, way, way deeper and way more pervasive than anybody is ready to deal with. And the fact of the matter is, I continue to have conversations like this because I will not stop. And, I figure that at one day, whether it's a conversation with you or, conversation with whoever I wind up having a conversation with, at some point, somebody who has a moral compass that's not spinning will go, that's enough. We're going to bring this thing to justice. Yeah. And, the good news is I'm continuing to fight for that day, and I'm going to continue to fight for that day until that day shows up.
Absolutely. What you're saying there about Arbutus and Arcutis back in 2018, that to me tells me that one of the major investors being Justin Trudeau within those companies means that there was massive insider trading from him in regards to that.
Well, so there's a mysterious amount of funding. And by the way, there's a plane crash and a dead former premier and a bunch of other things. If you go into this story, it reads like a Dan Brown novel. Like you sit there going, holy shit, there's some really weird shit going on. Because these companies coming out of the University of British Columbia, these companies were on the ropes financially I mean, they were fighting each other. There was two different founders who were at each other's throats, both arguing about who really did what invention and all this kind of stuff. And if you go back and look at how many different name changes there are of different companies that were all part of the spin out of UBC, it's actually quite remarkable. I mean, it reads like a novella from some sort of tawdry affair. But mysteriously, there are these large infusions of investment from undisclosed sources. And what I have said many times is I think it would be a great little FOIA-like request to file in Canada to go, okay, why is it that suddenly, out of the blue, a company that's never produced anything, never done anything, never, had any commercial activity at all, suddenly winds up with tens of millions of Canadian dollars of investments from undisclosed locations that are coming allegedly from different foundations that can't be named? Well, if you look, and I've said this many times, if you look at the Trudeau Foundation and you look at the timing of these grants, I find something that would be very interesting to uncover. I don't know if it's there. I've said many times it takes a Canadian citizen to do what needs to be done. So far, there hasn't been any Canadian citizen who's done it, which is to ask the question, where the hell did the money come from to save these companies from bankruptcy? Yeah. Who paid for those wonderful, very expensive PTAB lawsuits with Moderna? Who did all of those things? And the answer is, what we do know is by 2019, we know that Canada knew that no matter whose horse was picked for what was going to be called the vaccine program for the pandemic, we know Canada was going to win either side of that race, whether it was the Moderna side who was fighting the patents in the PTAB hearings, or whether it was BioNTech. We knew they were going to win, and we knew that somewhere along the line there was going to be a kickback that was going to flow back to the economy of Canada. And so Canada's role in this thing has always been this mysterious question that nobody bothers to ask. And once again, go back to what's the motivation for not asking? And lo and behold, north of the border is the same as south of the border. Yeah. You cannot kick the sacred cow of universities. Universities are this phenomenal money laundering exercise, which allows public officials to actually shove money into their own pockets and the pockets of the people that they need to pay back. And it all happens through these alleged grants and all the nonsense that are happening. And the fact of the matter is, there's questions that need to be asked and answered, but there is no question at all that in the case of the University of British Columbia innovations that led to the death shot stabilization and delivery, the lipid nanoparticle from the death shot, there's no question that the fingerprints of Canadians are not on every single one of those shots.
Yeah. And I know a couple of people in Canada, Shelley Hipson and Paul Westhaver, are incredible with freedom of information requests. This might be something that I'll put in their hands and see if they want to run with it. Yeah, because that we might be able to unearth something pretty incredible about this. Now, it's been several years now since obviously everything's happened with the pandemic, but from what you've investigated and seen, what would you say the true purpose of that safe and effective was?
Well, the true purpose was to lie, and the true purpose was very simple. In 2018, the definition of adverse event was changed. Adverse event used to mean, are you ready for this? An event that was adverse.
Funny old thing, that.
Yeah. In 2018, that was changed. The World Health Organization and all of its minions around the world changed the adverse event to being only those things that were published and already known in the literature, which means if something has not been published and already known in the literature, it can't be counted as an adverse event. So the cool thing is, change the rule of what the ordinary course of the word means, and lo and behold, you don't have adverse events. So you can lie without the public knowing that you're lying based on a change of definition that nobody knew about. Safe and effective never was safe and effective. It was a means by which a code would be inserted into the minds of the public to make them believe that somehow or another there had been some sort of scientific review of the material. Now let's go in order of the sequence of what was done. We were told that ventilators were safe and effective. But what we weren't told was that if you hyperoxygenate the injuries of lungs that were going on during the flu season of 2019 going to 2020, you actually kill people on ventilators.
Yeah.
We were told that remdesivir, the hospital protocol that was used to allegedly be an antiviral, we were told that that was safe and effective as an emergency use authorization only because we failed to look at the ZMAP protocol that was done on remdesivir in 2017 and 2018, when it turns out that the remdesivir exposed populations to Ebola in the Ebola trials in Africa were 53% mortality, leading in mortality people with Ebola. It turns out it was more deadly to get the treatment than to get the disease.
Yeah.
And it was so egregious that the World Health Organization, which, as you know, is known for its high degree of moral certitude, the World Health Organization pulled it from its protocol because it was too deadly. Yet we decided to inject it into people in hospitals all across America and around the world. Here's a tiny little problem. Any physician who did that was at least guilty of reckless homicide, if not premeditated murder, because the data that was published on the lethality of remdesivir put the lethality at 53%. Lethal, not injury, dead.
Yeah.
And what we have is a world in which we were able to convince people that safe and effective was code word for don't ask. We are going to tell you what we're going to do, and we're going to tell you that that's what's going to happen. And listen, Deborah Birx is now admitting this. Robert Redfield already admitted it. And a number of people have admitted the fact that in April of 2020, and once again in June of 2020, both BioNTech and Moderna called mRNA injections experimental gene therapies, as classified as such by the FDA. They didn't change that in a legal definition.
No.
Now, if you told the public that they were going to roll up their sleeves and get experimental gene therapies, the public would have said, hell no.
Yeah.
But when you get religious leaders and politicians and everybody else yelling that this was a great, rushed vaccination approval process, and you have everybody on mainstream media saying the words safe and effective when the criteria for safe had never been met, ever. There is a document at the FDA, which was published in 2016, updated in 2018, which actually states what a safe vaccine protocol must include. None. When I say none, I mean zero. None of that protocol was followed. So following their own published rules, following their own published what they call science, they violated their own standard. And they knew that they were going to engage in what the Federal Trade Commission refers to as deceptive medical practices.
Yeah.
And the Federal Trade Commission's definition of that is very simple. When you mislead the public using a term meant to deceive, and let's get really clear, the term vaccination has been used meant to deceive for a long time. This is not a COVID problem. This predates COVID. The minute the flu shot was called a flu vaccine, it's a lie.
Yeah.
Vaccines, in their original definition, were an active or an attenuated agent, which was supposed to stimulate either the suppression or blockage of infection and transmission. And then when it came to the influenza shots, when it came to HPV, which has been injected into numerous women with terrible side effects, when it came to all of the more recent injections that we have, what happened was we decided to call experimental gene therapy, and we decided to call manipulated biologic engineered material vaccines. And we did it with the intent to deceive the public, because everybody will hide behind the, well, it's a vaccine, it's got to be good for you, without ever considering the possibility that the term was deceptively used. I encouraged at the beginning of this pandemic for no one no one in the what was called medical freedom movement to use the term vaccine.
Yeah.
I said, do not fall for it. Do you know how unpopular I was among the medical freedom movement?
Oh yeah, I mean, I can imagine that they were probably panicking about the bottom line at that point.
Yeah, but they're also I mean, I'm talking about people who we all hold up as these were the champions of trying to get truth and information in the COVID thing. When
Yeah.
I said, call it what it is, it's a biological gene therapy or a bioweapon. Use either of those terms. Do
Yeah.
not call it a vaccine. And it turns out that people that we've mentioned in this podcast and people that everybody knows and loves were very upset because they said, well, you're going to upset people by calling them that. Well,
That's the truth.
okay, newsflash, I don't care. If Ralph Barrett calls the thing he made biowarfare enabling technology, I'm going to go ahead and use his term.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Now, is there anything within intellectual property rights for AI and quantum computing that concerns you for the future, especially with the move towards neural links and brain chips and also using brain tissue to power computers? Is there a line in the sand where you say this isn't where we should be heading? But is there anything that you're seeing that's really concerning you for the future of humanity?
Well, so starting with the end, artificial intelligence is not a worry for me at all, because it's an oxymoron in its very construction as a term.
Mm-hmm.
Intelligence was a construct that we invented for the industrial age, and intelligence was set up specifically to be pattern recognition so that we could actually celebrate people who were really good at matching shapes and doing numbers on spreadsheets and so forth. We once upon a time had the entirety of human existence that evolved based on wisdom, which is that which we learn from experience and apply from experience.
Yeah.
We invented intelligence in the industrial age. Intelligence didn't exist before then. So intelligence as a construct itself is a fallacy. It's just celebrating pattern recognition. And insofar as you have pattern recognition, it serves a purpose, but it's not, a threat, existential threat to anybody. Now we make it artificial, which makes it funny because we're now taking an artificial construct and making an artificial construct artificial. Well, newsflash, two artificials don't make real. You're taking a horrifically bad construct, which was built for the industrial age, and you're telling me now you're going to make it a robot. Well, big freaking deal. You know what artificial intelligence can't do? It can't anticipate a piece of data that it didn't know existed. You know why? Because it's only as good as the inputs that are given to it to learn.
Yeah.
And the problem with AI, as it's currently constructed and in the future, is it's only capable of digesting that which we feed it. It cannot anticipate the things that are not fed into it. As I said before, I teach a course called the 12 Senses course. We have 12 cranial nerves, which means we have 12 direct wired into our brain senses. Since Aristotle, Chris, we've only been authorized to acknowledge 5 of the 12.
Oh, yeah.
So here's a tiny little problem. Is AI going to actually pick up the other 7 intelligences, the other 7 senses, the other 7 attributes of human awareness that we don't even acknowledge and have not acknowledged since Aristotle? Is there any chance that we're going to build a machine where the inputs based on about 2.7 of our neurologic capacity senses, is there any worry that a 2.7 machine-based AI is going to compete with a fully functioning 12 cranial nerve, 12 sense human? And the answer is, doesn't have a chance. The reason why I've been able to do what I've been able to do over the last 5 years and avoid censors. I mean, go back and look. My YouTube channel wasn't taken down. But that's because I knew YouTube's algorithm.
Yeah.
And I literally spoke in a jamming frequency that made their AI incapable of flagging my content. Now, here's a little question. Do I fear AI? No, I proved that an intellectual human being can outsmart the machine. I have a beautiful video that I did with a dear friend of mine, Dan Goldstein, where we talked about the CNBC IQ 100 index, which was a really fun market index. We crushed the Dow. We crushed the S&P. We crushed the Russell 1000. We outperformed all of them.
Yeah.
Using our data for this, augmented, not artificial, augmented intelligence. Now, what's the difference? Augmented intelligence says we're going to use computational efficiency to look at vast amounts of information, but we're going to put human intellect as the input, not machine-based learning models. We're going to actually integrate a human's intellect with augmentation that is from computational efficiency. And lo and behold, by doing that, we kicked the ass of every single market index on Earth. And we traded it. So the good news is we made money on the back of having to eat our own dog food. Here's the tiny little problem. When people fear AI, it's because they don't understand the full capacity of a fully functioning human. If you understand the full capacity of a fully functioning human, you have no fear of AI because it can't beat you. What it can do is it can render obsolete what humans shouldn't be doing in the first place. If you are a robot on an assembly line, whether that assembly line is an education institution, whether it's a factory, whether it's anything else, and you are fearing AI, well, good for you, because you shouldn't be a robot in the first place.
Yeah.
So if you lose your robot job, okay, I'm okay with that, because the great news is it's going to kick you in the ass and get you to do something that you ought to be doing, which is actually something that, God forbid, requires your ingenuity, your creativity, and is worthy of your life force. So do I worry about it? Not in the least, because I've already proven, and I'm one of the few people who have the empirical proof, that when it comes to human versus AI, I've beaten AI every time. And that's because I recognize all of my 12 senses, and God forbid I use them.
Yeah. But my concern is the fact that we are moving towards a transhumanism agenda.
Yeah.
They do want to merge man with machine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And that's
yeah. And here's the thing. You're exactly right. But guess what? Our job as humans in that scenario is to present the compelling alternative. You know, here's what I've criticized all of my dear friends who are worried about transhumanism. I've said, before we even talk about the trans part of humanism, we should actually examine our own humanity. Because if we were doing a good job of being ambassadors for what it means to be fully capable human beings, then the trans part of humanism, the efficiencies drawn from humanism, this whole idea that somehow or another we shouldn't use currency, we should use our hands, we shouldn't use, I don't know, we should chip ourselves so that we don't have to carry phones, whatever. Bullshit. You know what I do? When I'm invited now to anything, I say analog only.
Yeah. Yeah.
Guess what? I get closer friendships. I get closer associations. I get shorthand communication, which an AI can't even intercept, because it turns out we can go, oh, you remember that? Yeah. And then that's shorthand for 10 other things. The great news is we as humanity that's still operating in the organic analog space need to do a better job of advocating for it. You have a Yuval Harari that looks at the world as though we're nothing but computer chips. Well, guess what? Yuval Harari is a computer chip. That's okay. Let him die that way. But why don't we, instead of promoting the fear that he's trying to engender, why don't we do a better job of advocating for the fully functioning human, where the AI, where the transhumanism, where all these things cannot compete? I said to people at my 12 Senses workshop, I said, you know, the number of people who've asked me to do it online is laughable.
Yeah.
I'm trying to teach you in a laboratory setting how to rewire 12 of all of your senses. And you're going to ask me to do that with a flat computer interface that allows you to have sight and hearing, and that's it. Does anybody see the problem with that little exercise? The whole point is to train all 12 of your cranial nerves. Guess what you're not going to do on a flat computer screen? You're not going to train all 12 of your cranial nerves. So, and the point is simple. And this, by the way, is my passion. So you hit a soapbox for me. You know, if we as humanity do a better job of marketing what it means to be human, all of the faux efficiencies that are how we're being sold the bill of goods around transhumanism will fall away as laughable. They're laughable. You're not gaining efficiency if you use your handprint to buy a Starbucks coffee.
No.
Like, that's bullshit. Don't fall for it. Recognize that it's far better to go to Costa Rica and go to, I don't know, Arenal and get on the side of a volcano and watch how coffee is grown and roasted and processed. And then you'll have a different appreciation for coffee, and you won't go to Starbucks to get it.
Yeah.
Because you'll buy it, you know. And so think about this. The transactions that we're fooled into believing are transactions we need to worry about are absolute nonsense. None of what we're being sold has an upside. It is the compromise of our identity where we are told that we are nothing but a digital signature. BS.
Yeah.
You know what? I will never be digitized.
No, that's fantastic.
Not going to happen.
Can you tell us also about cellular membrane ionic signaling? And also, do you think things like 5G and other energy systems can interfere with the human body and mind?
You know, the cool thing is you just triggered me one more thing. It's this way now, not the other way. You asked me these loaded questions, but the good news is I have a study where I can grab shit out of either closet. So this book, Creation, Separation, and the Mind, The Three Towers of Singularity, book that I just co-authored with Dr. Bill Wisman and Dr. Norbert Schwarzer, grows out of work that I started doing back in my graduate school days. You know, we have never fully understood the mystery of magnetism. And this doesn't sound like an answer to your question, but it is the answer to your question. You know, we accepted a general atomic model, which was basically an orbital model, where we said that there's this nucleus, and inside of it a proton and a neutron, and then we have these electrons spinning on the outside.
Yeah.
And we've decided that that's the way the universe works, because we go, well, of course, it's a fractal of then the solar system. We see that, and then we see a galaxy, and we see that, and we go, okay, you know, what's in the micro is in the macro, all that kind of nonsense. All of which is fine, but wrong. And the reason why it's wrong is because we don't understand the opening act. And the opening act is something that the French physicist Coulomb described as how he described the birth of a star, which is you take a highly charged, highly magnetized field, and then into that field you inject a plasma, which changes the charge of a particle, and that's how we get the reaction that begets a sun. Well, it turns out that inside the human body, we have exactly the same phenomenon that happens. It's how we actually get the first pulse in our heart.
Yeah.
Now, as much as science has tried to unravel the mysteries of life, one of the giant questions that has never been touched is how on earth do you get a pacemaker in the heart, which is required to be a differentiated cell line, which starts beating itself into existence, when heart tissue needs to have a pulse to beat into existence? You follow the question?
Yeah.
There's a chicken and egg problem.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a pulse to get the cells to differentiate, but you have to get the differentiated cells to get a pulse, which means somewhere there's something we're not understanding. And it turns out that that's something that we didn't understand is what I started working on back in my graduate school days, and started recognizing that there are things that are happening in the cell membrane which create magnetic fields, very small, very micromagnetic fields. And it turns out that when you fully understand that, you realize that all of particle physics based on a series of two-dimensional projections actually fails. And for the last 120 years, we've had a system built on a fallacy that giant book unwraps. So the good news is we've gone to the trouble of publishing a book where, just to give you a sense of the light nature of the reading, the average page looks a little like this.
Just a little bit, yeah.
But it is our mathematics and our prose that help us understand that the model that we've been using to look at the universe is falsifiable because of the perspective that we've taken. Now, here's the problem that your question elucidates, which is the reason why I'm taking you on this journey.
Yeah.
The problem is that because we have thought of a world of basically serial, meaning sequential analyses, where we understand something in 2 dimensions and we layer on another dimension, but also in 2 dimensions, then we layer on another dimension, also in 2 dimensions. We stack these things as observations. We come up with really nonsensical concepts like quantum mechanics. Now, quantum mechanics is only a derivative of the way we think. If we stopped thinking inappropriately, we wouldn't worry about quantum anything. We'd realize that there is, in fact, a whole series of dynamics that we're not even factoring, and we make up the quantum field to make up for that problem. The problem, however, and this goes to your point, and it's a very important point, is that if you start messing with fields that you don't understand, then what you can do is you can disrupt the normal flow of normal organic fields in a way that has unintended consequences. Yeah. Not unlike what we did with our conversation about CRISPR. If we don't understand the full nature of how the DNA wound into chromosomal patterns interacts with life, similarly, if we don't understand the fields in which we operate, we don't understand the magnetic fields, the electrical fields, and the RF fields in which we have normal experience of life, then when we flood it with contaminated signals, whether those signals are a radio frequency, like a 5G, whether they are another part of the electromagnetic spectrum, or whether they are even photonic spectrum, we can do serious damage to systems we don't understand. And the proliferation of that problem is immense. Part of the reason why Kim and I live in a place that has no cell service at all. Mm-hmm. You walk outside with no cell tower anywhere, is because we don't want to be bombarded with noise of radiation that we don't want in our life. We are huge advocates for de-amplifying extraneous interference, whether that is radio frequency, whether that is different forms of electromagnetism, or whether it is photonic frequencies that we don't want in our life. But these are choices that we're making because we understand that the analog reality, like laying outside on the ground under the stars, where you have no RF interference, is actually a healing modality. And I do that very frequently. I do that because I'm concerned about the fact that we have unconsidered exposure to things where, because of convenience, we've been told it's essential, but we haven't been told, yes, but what are the effects that is going to have over a period of time? Yeah. And my biggest concern with that is that in my early research, and I did a lot of collaboration with some researchers up at Brigham and Women's Hospital, we were able to show that the cell membranes and the oligomerization of proteins in the membranes, meaning the junction between proteins on the cell membrane, actually were very good indicators of metastatic disease, largely cancers. And that was work we did 30 plus years ago. Yeah. And so knowing how dangerously manipulatable those proteins are, and how simple it is to change magnetic field properties and electric field properties and ultimately create significant alterations in the cell function, is something that I was very sensitive to over 30 years ago. Now, 5G itself, as you probably know, has become somewhat of a dog whistle, because 5G was around for a long time before it was in commercial use. Military has been using that. As a matter of fact, all of the public spectrum of 5G was auctioned off by the Department of Defense. 5G has been around for a long time. When people tell me 5G proliferation is the reason why X happened, I laugh at it because 5G was around a lot longer than the public knows about.
Yeah.
The reason why the Defense Department got rid of it is because it actually wasn't overly effective at penetrating a lot of things that they needed signals to penetrate. So the bad news for 5G is it didn't work as well as people wanted it to work. And when they sold off the spectrum, the Department of Defense knew they were selling off a boondoggle, but a lot of people took it on as though it's some sort of giant boogeyman. Well, I'm going to tell you that RF generally and the proliferation of unrestricted power in the pushing out of radio frequency energy is a horrible problem that we have never fully understood in terms of its health effects, in terms of its social effects, in terms of the effects it might have on community behavior. We actually are, blind leading the blind in an abysmal situation there.
Yeah.
But is it 5G that I'm concerned about? No. It is the proliferation of way too much power being broadcast across way too many frequencies where we don't understand their entire effect. But I can guarantee you, living in a place without it, you can definitely feel the effect of it not being there. So I do know that. But yeah, I mean, there are tons of those topics where, humans, unfortunately, have been sold once again a bill of goods where we're sold the advantage of a thing where we're not really ever even trained on asking the question yet, but is it good for us in other dimensions?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I don't know whether you've ever managed to look through the book written by Arthur Fistenberg called The Invisible Rainbow, where he
Yeah.
actually cites, over from the invention of electricity and Marconi with radio, he attributes that to many outbreaks of illnesses around the
Oh,
world.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
listen, I mean, the 60 hertz that's pumping through your walls was actually not aligned to human health. It was aligned to the interest that JP Morgan had in metering electricity.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a funny old thing, that, isn't it?
Yeah.
I also hear you are with Sasha Stone on Sunday at his Revelations tour. What are you hoping
I
to
am
cover?
indeed.
What are you going to cover, and what kind of impact message do you want to get out to the people there? Not to be out a spoiler alert or anything.
Oh no, listen, Sasha and I go a long way back. We worked together on some really fun projects where we were trying to clean up the soot in Ulaanbaatar, changing the configuration of gur stoves in Mongolia so that kids could breathe and not have to have so many problems with asthma. We've worked together for a long time. We worked together to set up the New Earth University and New Earth Institute and a bunch of other things. Sasha and I have had a beautiful, very wonderfully, comic and ironic relationship. As you can see from even the photos, I've always been the bald guy with the bow tie and the suit, and he's been Sasha. Like he's the the rocker, and he has a very distinct personality and a wonderful persona. But I'll tell you what Sasha and I found out early in our life is we shared a very beautiful picture of what the possibility of humanity really is. Yeah. And the roads we've taken to get there are very different roads, but the destination, more often than not, is dangerously close to the same, if not the same. Yeah. I think Sasha, as an iconoclast, which I love, he has the ability to speak very poetically about the way the world's working, the way it's not working, who's benefiting, what some of the archetypal stories are. And Sasha brings a lot of archetypal stories into his narrative, which is something that I find to be always a refreshing perspective. There is a view of the world, I think, is described through our myths narrative that I think he accesses that are very different than the way I approach things. But what I love is that we have always found in our dialogue a way of appealing to audiences where we can cover any topic. And while we can model, in some cases, rather vigorous disagreement, we model it with a degree of mutual respect and decency, which I find to be quite refreshing, because Sasha would never line up behind what I say and go, I agree with all that Dave Martin says. And I would not do the same with him.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the best things that I can guarantee about every meeting with Sasha Stone is you'll find two people deeply committed to the best of humanity,
Yeah.
deeply committed to rooting out the worst of the corruption and going about it in very different ways. But most importantly, we're not trying to get to an echo chamber of being the same, right? There's nothing about Sasha that's going to try to turn into, the bald bow tie wearing Dave Martin. And there's nothing about me that's going to turn into, the ex-rocker. I think still ex-rocker. I don't know if he's still doing any rock and roll, but,
Yeah.
I'm not going to grow hair, and I'm not going to have Sasha's appearance. But what our deep commitment is to model respectful, honoring engagement. And that experience is something we lack in our society.
Yeah.
We like to see people, for whatever reason, who kind of ideologically or, historically or socially kind of align. And the value that Sasha and I bring is we don't try to beat each other. What we try to do is, in each other's presence, amplify the field effect that we both have.
Yeah.
And I know I always come away from a meeting with Sasha a better version of Dave Martin.
That's fantastic.
And I think that when people come away and they have an experience of the two of us together, they are always informed. There's no question we're going to cover some of these topics, but I can guarantee you we're going to go into things like education. We're going to tear apart what education is. We're going to tear apart what community is. What is community for real, rather than, this digital nonsense that we call social gatherings and social media and social this and social that. We're going to unpack those kinds of things. And the fact is, we're going to sit down together, and it'll be 4 hours that, let's just say that if Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates and Yuval Harari got together, I could probably guess 99% of what they would say and what the outcome would be.
Yeah.
But if you put Dave Martin, Sasha Stone together for the exact same amount of time, sitting across from each other in a couch, I can guarantee you that nobody would even begin to guess or handicap what the outcome's going to look like. And so I like being on my side of that deal. I like the surprise.
Yeah.
But yeah, Sasha's a great, great human being, a dear, dear friend, and somebody who I celebrate for his passion. I celebrate for his initiative, and I think he's an amazing human being. I love that no matter how many times people have tried to change him, he is as certain as the sunrise.
Yeah. No, it sounds like it's going to be an incredible event. A couple more things just before we wrap up today. Now, you have been to Antarctica, and you're probably the only person I've ever spoken to that's been to Antarctica, and it's fascinated me for many years.
Yeah.
What was it like? And is there a secrecy about it that would allude to some of the claims made by Admiral Byrd?
Well, so here's the funny thing. Kim and I met there. People don't know that.
No,
and I probably somewhere have the most famous inappropriate picture. It's on my phone, so it's going to suck because you're not going to get a good version of it. But if you watch Future Dreaming, the good news is you can see this picture. But we've just changed the viewer rating on our show now. This is, see if we can get there. Let's see if I can move this so that we can see the picture. There you go, kind of. There you go.
Yes, I can see somebody.
That's me skinny dipping below the Antarctic Circle, jumping into the last named ocean that I had never swum in before, where the water temperature when I jumped in was -2 degrees centigrade. So um, it was cold. And let's just say that the picture, you'll see it in future dreaming. There was nothing to really see when you're jumping naked into ice water that's -2 centigrade. There's truly nothing to see other than my bare ass going into the water. Um, but we flew in from Punta Arenas, Chile. We flew into a military base on King George Island. If you go on Google Earth and you look at King George Island, you'll see a whole bunch of military bases, which is fascinating given the fact that Antarctica allegedly doesn't have any military operations anywhere.
Yeah.
So there is that little detail of, oh, hold on a second. We were met with folks who were very upset that we were taking pictures of a C-130 that was that slid off the runway. And I have wonderful photographs of all of the military aircraft that were down there. So for a peace-inhabited, peace-loving, penguin-filled colony, I thought it was interesting that we landed in a military base in a military transport plane, and then we got on the ship and we went down the that kind of big peninsula, sailed in through and into Deception Island, which is the active volcano down there, and went down to as far as the ice would let us go. We were on an icebreaker ship, and so we were able to go, through the pack ice for a while. More killer whales and humpback whales than you could shake a stick at. I mean, anybody who tells me that there's biodiversity problems has never been to Antarctica, because there is more life there than you could count.
Yeah.
What I do know is that our ability to get on and off the boat and our ability to see things, and if you look at the movie Future Dreaming, you'll see the scenery. It is truly a remarkable place. There's no question. It's absolutely fabulous. And given the fact that we did the crossing by airplane, I actually got to fly from Chile across the Southern Ocean and get to King George Island. So from the standpoint of kind of the geography of it, I got to see the geography because I was sitting next to the window and I was watching the geography. Knew what bearings were, knew which way we're going, all that kind of stuff. What I would say is that I worked with Jeff Wilson, who is the guy who was the first person to do the unaided land crossing. If you look up Jeff Wilson, he's an Australian guy. He's done a couple of crossings and had a bunch of material drop shipped across the continent. If you look at his crossing pattern, it is across a piece of Antarctica, but it certainly is not across the continent the way it was built. And so what I know is that the official story and what we were able to see don't quite match up because, like I said, you land on a military base on a continent that's supposed to not have military. There's a self-evident problem.
Yeah.
When you're told not to take photographs because the C-130 is part of an Air Force operation, then it kind of feels like there's a military operation. So I certainly saw enough to convince me that the full picture of what we are told is at least partial propaganda. The flip side of it is the people who go, well, it doesn't exist and it's not even there and all that kind of nonsense. It's just a fallacy because I literally, flying from India, I flew from India to North America, to South America, to Antarctica. And it turns out that one of the things that happened for some reason is I kind of have a turtle brain. I can't get disoriented anywhere. So am I convinced that I actually transited the distances that I went? Absolutely, because I know how I traveled. Happened to like to sit next to windows and happened to like to sit and watch the world go by outside of windows, even when it's 14 to 16-hour flights.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. what I also know is that my experience down there was life altering. Um, there was something about the experience beyond meeting Kim, which is obviously a very life altering experience.
Yeah.
Um, but there's something about the place that we don't fully understand because there are things that are available in terms of accessing insight and perspectives that I have not had somewhere else. And I've been to both poles. So, well, not all the way to the poles, but I've been in the Arctic as far north as I've been the Antarctic in the south.
Yeah.
Um, and I have to say that Antarctica is a different place.
Yeah. It certainly does look like it from what I've researched and looked into over the
Yeah.
years. Yeah. Now, one last thing. Have you ever come across a patent for a time machine?
Yes, several of them. But the one that I find to be my favorite is one that was actually included a faster than speed of light engine, which is part of how it was supposed to work. And this is one of my favorite ones because it used hyperpolarized gas, noble gases, as its acceleration. The idea is if you hyperpolarize a noble gas and you shoot it out the back end of the propulsion system, you ultimately will accelerate to the speed of light, which is actually a very funny little concept. But little tiny problem in the patent is that they didn't describe the braking system, which I find to be fascinating. If let's just say we're on our way to Alpha Centauri and we want to go in a faster than the speed of light engine, um, one would certainly hope that you'd be able to calculate the midpoint of that flight with a high degree of accuracy because you got to start braking at the speed of light too.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you smash into it at some version of the speed of light or near the speed of light, which would be a terrible way to smash into something.
Yeah.
And I found that to be a mathematic problem in the patent. There are a number of patents where, if you look closely at them, you see propulsion systems and other systems that are specifically oriented towards what we would call some sort of relativity suspension or time suspension machines. I happen to also have on one of my boards a gentleman who is the director of Area 51 and had a number of years where I was able to interact with him. It was a very fascinating experience to learn, through those conversations, various things that they have investigated in various levels. What I would say is this. I think that the most interesting pursuit that humans can engage is recognizing that time itself is an illusion that we've created. And like artificial intelligence, a time machine itself is an oxymoronic situation as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have within our capability, and this is where I'm definitely into Dave's opinion,
Mm-hmm.
but it's based on my lived experience. So that's why I'm confident in going here as a lived experience story. I think we have greater aperture of our time awareness than we give ourselves credit for. And I think that if we give ourselves the ability to open up our aperture, we'll realize that we don't need a machine to achieve what most people would call time travel. I think the power of memory, the power of recollection, and the homing capabilities inside of human beings are far in excess of what our current understanding is.
Yeah.
And I think exploring that, participating in it, being part of that is pretty fun.
Yeah. And as you said before about the likes of DNA and what people call junk DNA, I do believe that the human ability is far greater than we are, programmed to believe and understand. And,
Yeah.
it would be like jumping into an aircraft and flicking a lot more switches and turning a lot more things on. All of a sudden, that thing can fly and take off. And I do
Yeah.
believe that, there is a realm of possibility that these junk DNA within the human makeup, if
Yeah.
switched on, would turn every human being into something completely different to what we actually think we are.
Yeah, and Kim's point, which I really agree with wholeheartedly, is if we weren't such amazing beings, there wouldn't be such a war to get rid of us.
Yeah.
We certainly for the last 8,000 years, religion, society, politics, economics, has had a war on humanity. I told you before, Aristotle was the one that forced us into this nonsense belief that we only have five senses.
Mhm.
By the middle of the kind of 1500s to 1600s, it was a capital crime to question that.
It's insane.
If there's a death sentence for asking a question, then guess what? There's a war on humanity. And if there's a war on humanity, it's because humanity must be pretty awesome and somebody's afraid of it.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a great way to end our conversation by saying, become fearless.
Yeah.
Become fearless, because the more you access the fullness of your humanity, the more the incumbent systems don't know what to do with you. And the more they don't know what to do with you, the more dangerous you become. And that is exactly what life is about, being as dangerous to the establishment as you can possibly become.
Absolutely. And as we always say here on the Atlantic Underground podcast, we have to believe nothing and question everything.
There you go.
And, this has been a very powerful and incredible interview. I think this is going to empower a lot of people to consider who they are, what they are, and what they can achieve in this lifetime. And I can, from the depths of my heart here, I really do have to thank you for coming on today and talking to me. This has been, again, probably a game changer for me, and hopefully a game changer for many other people out there.
Chris, it is always an honor to see you. I'm deeply grateful. I'm deeply grateful for your passion. I'm grateful for the platform that you've created. And in terms of aspiring to having conversations with anybody, I like to have real conversations with real people.
Yeah.
So I'm happy that we've had this conversation. I'm looking forward to the next time.
Absolutely. And we'll catch up soon.
All right.
We won't leave it as long as last time.
All right. That sounds good.
Thanks very much, Dave. I look forward to speaking to you again. Cheers, mate.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.